A baby's heart suddenly stops in the middle of the night. Alarms blare. Doctors rush to the scene, their voices sharp with urgency. They work tirelessly, every second stretching into eternity. Yet nothing seems to make a difference. The tiny body remains still. Just as hope begins to fade, a golden retriever steps forward. Charlie moves with quiet determination, his golden fur shimmering under the hospital's harsh fluorescent lights. In a world ruled by science, this dog is about to challenge everything they believe to be true. At St. Adrian's Hospital, the night had been calm. Nurses moved through their usual routines. Patients stared blankly at television screens. The rhythmic hum of ventilators filled the air. And then, something unusual happened. Charlie walked through the hospital's automatic doors, unnoticed. No security stopped him. No one questioned his presence. Perhaps they assumed he was a therapy dog or a stray that had wandered in by mistake. But Charlie wasn't lost. His movements were precise, purposeful. He padded down the sterile hallways, his nails clicking softly against the polished floor. A weary nurse spotted him, but, too drained from her shift, dismissed him with a sigh. Charlie didn't pause. He had a destination. The neonatal intensive care unit on inside. Beneath the glow of softly beeping machines, a fragile infant lay still. Tubes and wires connected her tiny body to life-saving equipment. She was fighting for every breath. Charlie stopped at the glass chamber, his soft brown eyes locking onto the baby inside. Then, with deliberate grace, he nudged the door open and slipped inside. Moving gently, as if guided by something unseen, Charlie curled up beside the crib. He positioned himself as close as the tangle of medical equipment allowed. A quiet shift filled the room. The baby's erratic heart rate, once unstable, steadied. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Why had Charlie come here? How did he know? And why did his presence bring such peace? The night wore on. Nurses moved in and out of the ICU, unaware of the quiet bond forming between the dog and the infant. Outside, Nurse Grace sat at the station, rubbing her eyes. Exhaustion pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had been caring for this fragile child for months, watching helplessly as the baby's condition shifted between hope and despair. But tonight, something felt different. The air was lighter. The weight she had carried for so long seemed less crushing. A thought tugged at the back of her mind. Something was off. Pushing herself up from her chair, she decided to check on the baby one last time before her shift ended. Stepping into the ICU, her gaze immediately landed on a golden shape curled up beside the crib. She froze. Charlie. Her first instinct was to shoo him away, to call security, and remove him from the sterile environment. But something held her back. She hesitated. The baby's vital signs were steady, more stable than they had been in days. A coincidence, or was the dog helping? Memories surged, memories she had buried deep. Years ago, her own child had been here, fighting, struggling to breathe. She had sat by his bedside, clinging to anything that gave her hope, no matter how small. Now, here was this dog, resting beside another helpless child. And against all logic, the baby was improving. Charlie lifted his head, meeting her gaze. His eyes were calm, unwavering. He wasn't causing harm. If anything, the child looked peaceful. Hope, disbelief, and wonder swirled inside Grace's chest. She knelt by the crib, reaching out to gently touch the baby's hand. A tiny movement, a faint twitch of fingers beneath hers. Her breath caught. This was no ordinary dog. And this was no ordinary night. Without fully understanding why, she let Charlie stay. As the night stretched on, Grace remained close. Her eyes flicked between the sleeping dog and the fragile infant, searching for answers she couldn't explain. How had Charlie found his way here? Why had no one stopped him? And why, against all medical odds, was the baby suddenly stabilizing? She leaned against the window, staring out at the distant city lights. Logic and intuition warred inside her mind. Her gaze drifted back to the child. How many nights had she stood helplessly by, watching machines do their best to sustain this tiny life? Yet tonight, something was different. Could it really be because of the dog? Her thoughts slipped back to the past. She had been in this position before, years ago, watching over her own son, fearing every labored breath, drowning in the helplessness that only a mother could know. The fear had been suffocating. She had prayed, begged for anything that could save him. And in the end, he had pulled through. But she had never forgotten the helplessness, the desperation. Tonight, she saw that same desperation in this child's fight. And she saw something else, too. Hope. Charlie lay, still, his head resting gently on his paws. His golden fur rose and fell with each quiet breath, his presence radiating an impossible calm. Grace knelt beside him, pressing her hand lightly against his back. Warmth. Steady. Grounding. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe in something she couldn't explain. Maybe she didn't need all the answers. Maybe, just this once, she just needed to trust. And so, as the hospital carried on with its endless rhythm of life and loss, she made a choice. She let Charlie stay. Despite initial skepticism, the hospital staff slowly began to accept Charlie's presence. At first, there were murmurs of discontent about the dog wandering into restricted areas, and a few doctors expressed their concerns. However, Grace quietly championed his cause, suggesting that, perhaps, just perhaps, his presence was influencing the baby's recovery. Though reluctant, the staff started noticing the child's gradual improvement, and with some hesitation, they agreed to let Charlie stay, at least for now. As days passed, an unspoken bond began to form. Between Grace and Charlie, something deeper than simple companionship developed. It wasn't just a nurse and a dog coexisting. It was a quiet, almost sacred connection. Each night, Grace found herself looking forward to his presence. She would sit beside him, sometimes whispering about her day, other times simply resting her head against the crib, finding solace in his quiet company. The weight she carried seemed lighter, even if just for a moment. Charlie remained steadfast, always close to the crib, never straying too far, and in his presence, Grace began to notice changes within herself. The grief she had long harbored over her son's near tragedy seemed to soften in Charlie's presence. His calming energy was contagious, offering a peace she hadn't felt in years. Their nightly ritual became routine. Grace checking on the baby, ensuring everything was stable, before settling down next to Charlie. And each night, Charlie would lift his head, watching her with those soft, knowing eyes, as if understanding her pain in a way no one else could. In those silent moments, the sterile walls of the hospital became something more. A place where unseen connections flourished, where a dog's presence carried unexplainable weight. Though no one could definitively explain the baby's progress, Grace knew Charlie had something to do with it. He wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline, and she wasn't willing to let him go. As the days turned into weeks, Charlie became a familiar sight in the ICU, a quiet but constant presence. Grace's subtle advocacy ensured his continued stay, but complications arose. The hospital wasn't a shelter, and sooner or later, administration took notice. The situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Dr. Carter, a senior physician known for his strict adherence to protocol, was the first to formally challenge Charlie's presence. "This is a hospital, not a kennel," he stated one afternoon. His voice clipped as he confronted Grace in the break room. "I've heard the stories, but we can't base medical decisions on superstition or sentimentality." Grace tensed, caught between her duty to the hospital and her unwavering belief in Charlie's role. She understood Dr. Carter's stance. Hospitals functioned on data and regulations, but Charlie was different. She couldn't explain it, yet deep down, she knew his presence was tied to the baby's survival. Every time Charlie is by the crib, the baby's condition stabilizes, Grace said, her voice both calm and resolute. When he leaves, the monitors show distress. You've seen the charts, Dr. Carter. You know the baby is improving, and Charlie is part of that. Dr. Carter folded his arms, unmoved. There's no medical evidence to support that a dog can heal a patient. We're removing him today. End of discussion. Grace's heart sank. She understood the constraints of hospital policies, but this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about something intangible yet undeniable. About life and death. The morning of Charlie's scheduled removal was tense. Grace arrived early, her hands trembling as she worked, trying to push away the inevitable. She hadn't told anyone what was happening. Meanwhile, the baby's health, which had shown steady improvement, began declining again. The ICU buzzed with anxious energy. The once stable machines now emitted erratic beeps, urgent distress signals that no one could ignore. Rushing to the crib, Grace saw Charlie already there, motionless. His gaze locked onto the child as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Then, the unthinkable happened. A long, piercing beep cut through the room. The baby's heart monitor flatlined. Alarms blared as nurses flooded in, but for a moment, everything felt frozen. Grace stood paralyzed as Charlie slowly rose and nudged the baby's tiny hand with his nose. Then, as if touched by an unseen force, the monitor flickered back to life. The heart rate, once absent, began to steady. The room fell into stunned silence. Grace's breath caught in her throat. No one spoke. No one could explain what had just happened. Dr. Carter, who had come to oversee Charlie's removal, stood in the doorway, his skepticism visibly shaken. We can't keep him here, based on this, Dr. Carter muttered, though the usual authority in his voice was missing. Grace knew this was no coincidence. Something profound was at play. Something beyond their understanding. Charlie returned to his place by the crib, calm and unwavering. In that moment, Grace realized he wasn't just an observer in this fight. For survival, he was part of it. And removing him could mean losing both him and the baby. The turning point had arrived. Grace had to act, and she had to act now. The tension in the ICU was suffocating. Security guards arrived, their presence a stark reminder of the rules being broken. Kneeling beside Charlie, Grace positioned herself between him and the guards, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. Please don't do this, she pleaded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You've all seen the baby's progress. It's real. I don't care if there's no scientific explanation. Charlie is helping. You can't take him away. A heavy silence followed. Dr. Carter's expression flickered with hesitation, but he quickly steeled himself. We have protocols, Grace, he said firmly. This isn't about belief or sentimentality. We need evidence, and there is none to support this. Tears brimmed in Grace's eyes, but her resolve remained. Then I'll take full responsibility. If anything goes wrong, it's on me. But I refuse to stand by and let that baby die when I know, deep in my gut, that Charlie is the reason she's still alive. Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Dr. Carter sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as he processed the situation. Finally, he muttered, One more night. But this is your responsibility, Grace. If this goes south, it's on you. Relief flooded through Grace, and she nodded gratefully. Thank you, she whispered. The guard stepped back, and the ICU gradually returned to its steady rhythm. Though the tension still lingered, Grace sat beside Charlie, her hand resting on his fur as the baby's monitor beeped in steady reassurance. That night, she remained vigilant, keeping a watch over both the baby and Charlie. As the hours crept by, exhaustion weighed on her, but she refused to leave. As the first light of dawn filtered into the ICU, something extraordinary happened. The baby, whose condition had been critical for so long, opened her eyes for the first time. Grace gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She immediately called for the doctors, who rushed in, their faces etched with disbelief. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, her vitals stronger than they had been in weeks. Charlie, still lying beside the crib, lifted his head. His brown eyes met Grace's, holding a quiet acknowledgement that his work was done. The doctors conducted test after test, searching for a medical explanation for the baby's sudden turnaround. But no matter how many results they analyzed, they couldn't account for the dramatic improvement. Dr. Carter, once the biggest skeptic, stood in silence, his expression unreadable. Though he said nothing, the weight of his doubt seemed to ease, replaced by something close to wonder. A few days later, the baby was transferred out of the ICU, her condition no longer critical. Sensing the shift, Charlie stood from his spot, beside the crib. He nudged Grace's hand one last time, his gentle eyes lingering on hers before he padded silently out of the room. Grace watched him go, her heart swelling with both gratitude and sorrow. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but one thing was certain. Charlie had been there when it mattered most, offering a kind of healing that extended beyond medicine. As the hospital returned to its usual routines, Grace found herself reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past weeks. The connection between Charlie and the baby, though beyond explanation, had been undeniable. Some things, she realized, weren't meant to be rationalized, only felt. Months later, standing by the hospital window and gazing down at the bustling city streets, Grace's thoughts drifted to Charlie. She wondered where he was now, what new purpose he had found. A gentle smile crossed her face. Miracles, she now believed, came in many forms, some as profound as a baby's recovery, others as simple as the quiet companionship of a dog. Did you enjoy this story? Do you believe that dogs have the power to save lives? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Dogs love us unconditionally, often more deeply than we love ourselves. Would you agree? Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next video, and have a great day.